Mother Knows Death, starring Nicole and Jemmy and Maria QK.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Mother Knows Death. Today's guest played a crucial role in putting the Golden State Killer in prison for life. But before we talk with our guest, we're going to talk a little bit about the Golden State Killer for those of you who are unfamiliar with the story.
Let me tell you, this episode is such an honor for me in particular because this is one of my favorite true crime cases that got me really interested in covering DNA and genetic genealogy. So I do a lot of that on the Gross Room. But this story has really interesting facts behind it. So for those of you unfamiliar with this case, from 1974 to 1986, there was this reign of terror throughout California. So the crime started in 1974 with over 120 known burglaries in Visalia, California. So that's just north of LA. And it eventually migrated to Sacramento and eventually Orange County, where over 50 women and girls were raped and 13 people were brutally murdered. So what makes this case so interesting is that throughout the years, they thought this perpetrator was different people in all these different areas, and they eventually connected them to one. So first, it started with the burglaries in Visalia. So that started in 74. They referred to that perpetrator as the Visalia ransacker. Then when the sexual assault started in Sacramento, that suspect was known as the East Area Rapist. And then the killings were attributed to the nickname the Original Night Stalker because this was before Richard Ramirez's time. As our YouTube live people know, we've talked about him in the past, but these are different people. So by the early 2000s, there's advancements in DNA, and Detective Paul Holes, anybody that's familiar with CrimeCon will be very familiar with Paul Holes. He figures out that the East Area Rapist and Original Night Stalker are the same guy. After comparing very early DNA samples, and so at that point, they're referring to the killer as EARONS, which was East Area Rapist, Original Night Stalker. So then at some point, they figure out that he has the same MO as the Visalia ransacker all the way over there. So they're kind of like, what the hell? We thought this was different people this entire time, and now we have these three people connected together. So fast forward a couple of years, Patton Oswalt's wife, Michelle McNamara, is writing about the case, and she coins the term Golden State Killer. So that kind of encapsulates everything going on in California. And you have to remember these crimes were going on between 74 and 86. And by the time Michelle McNamara was writing her book, it's 2016. So all this time, they don't know who this killer is.
What was her background that caused her? Is she just a reporter? She was just interested in the case? Like, what got her to reopen this case, kind of?
So she had a true crime blog. It was kind of like one of the first things ever like that was huge. And then I guess living in California, you just have this arguably one of the most horrific serial killers of our time doing these terrible things, which we'll get into in the episode, and how nobody has caught him. So she started...
I mean, that's so scary.
It is so scary. And they, for all these years are like, is this guy dead? Is he still living amongst us? What is going on? Why did nobody ever catch him? He had really weird MOs. He was doing very bizarre things. Like at some of the scenes, he would put a towel over the TVs and the computers. Or not the computers. That was because that wasn't around yet. But he would put towels over the televisions while he sexually assaulted these women. He would break into their houses and act like he lived there, make himself a meal. He would slide in the door, hide in somebody's closet for hours before letting himself...
God, that's so scary.
Yeah, before they knew he was even there. He would call the victims years after the assaults and torture them. It's terrifying.
So the last crime that this Golden State Killer committed was what year?
86. Well, these are known crimes, remember? So he might have committed even more that they don't even know are connected to him, but... They believe his reign of terror was 74 to 86.
It's just really crazy, too, that someone could be that out of their mind and violent for such a long period of time and then all of a sudden stop for years, or seemingly that we know about, stop and not do anything else for such a long time.
I don't want to give too many spoilers away, but this person was captured in 2018 using genetic genealogy. This man was in his early 70s and had committed all these crimes. So this was kind of the beginning of using genetic genealogy to solve cold cases, and it was huge in California because this guy terrorized the communities. I mean, in this book, the author goes over how all these communities, people weren't locking their doors. And after the crime started going on, families were sleeping in one bedroom and terrified because they just didn't know what was to come.
Yeah, I mean, that's just the scariest kind of crime ever. And we've talked about this, which I'm going to bring up with him in this interview as well. About we wrote the inspiration for the movie Scream last week, and we were talking about the Gainesville Ripper, and just when something like that is going on in your neighborhood, or what did we talk about? The DC sniper, for example, a little bit closer to us. Like when things like that are happening, and you have to live and do life every day and go to sleep at night at your house, but you know that this person is on the loose that wants to kill more people. There's a huge possibility that you could be next. So I can't imagine how terrifying that is for people.
No, and I think what I want to discuss too in this interview is that, this book was written largely from the perspective of the victims, which I appreciated having read so many true crime books because you're not really giving the killer, the fame they're desiring in some regard, but also we don't remember often that these cases are affecting real people. And by telling the story through their perspective of how the crime occurred, what was going on in their lives, and how it affected them for decades later, it was so impactful.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about the author. His name is Thien Ho, and he has prosecuted hundreds of high profile sexual assault, gang, and homicide cases over the 25-year course of his legal career. He's best known for successfully prosecuting Joseph DeAngelo, who is known as the Golden State Killer, as Maria said. Thien has an interesting background. He came to the United States from Vietnam as a refugee. As a child, he didn't even know how to speak English, and he rose all the way from being an intern to elected to Sacramento County District Attorney, where he currently is serving office today. He now has a book called The People versus the Golden State Killer, which is going to be released next Tuesday. So we're going to get to talk to Thien in a second.
This episode is brought to you by The Gross Room.
Guys, our yearly sale is over right now, but you could still get into the Gross Room for $5.99 a month. So if you are not a current member, you should definitely try it because you'll have access to thousands of posts, videos, articles, and more. This week we did so every week we do either a high profile death dissection, which is on cases that were not famous until usually crimes or even medical things have happened that have made people famous, or we do celebrity death dissections. So last week we did one on the movie Scream, as we had mentioned earlier, and that one was really interesting because we talk about the real life serial killer case that inspired that movie. This week we are working on Lindsay Clancy, who, if you recall, a few years ago, she was the mother who strangled her 3 children and then tried to kill herself by jumping out of a window. She survived and is now a paraplegic, and we get into all of the details of that case and what may have motivated her to do something like that. We also have a couple interesting cases in the Gross Room this week, showing a video that was going viral on the internet and talking about, all the comments that I see underneath the videos are like, what the hell's going on? And all these people tagging me in it. So I posted it in the Gross Room and explained what I believe is happening in that video. All that and more in the Gross Room.
Head over to thegrossroom.com now to sign up.
Hi, Thien. Welcome to Mother Knows Death.
Hi, how you doing? It's truly an honor to be on your show, and as I've said, love the title of the podcast, Mother.
Thank you. Before we get started, I just want to say this is one of the best true crime books I've ever read. I did it all in one take. I could not get enough of it. I think you did such an amazing job hopping between the timelines of when the crimes occurred versus what was going on in your world in modern day.
Mhm.
And the bonus for me is, as a layperson, you laid everything out very simply so I could understand everything between the DNA, what you guys did in the prosecutor's office. I appreciate it so much. I can't thank you enough for the way
That means
you laid
a
it
lot.
out.
That means a lot to me on it, and that is one of the challenges, really, of writing a book where you're jumping back and forth in time. because the scope was so big in trying to figure that out.
No, definitely. So I guess let's get started with, you talk about in the book when you first learned about the Golden State Killer, and then you kind of talk about in the office what went down when you guys discovered the DNA match. Can you talk about that time a little bit?
Most definitely. So, I've been a prosecutor for 25 years. I've been a lawyer for almost 28. And this was back in originally in 2012. In 2012, I tried my very first homicide case, and it involved Rajneet Singh. Her half naked body was found behind a brick wall in Rancho Cordova, not far from where the East Area rapist had committed his crimes. And so I was just going out to the crime scene, getting ready for trial and kind of seeing where everything was placed. And I happened to be in the car with my buddy, who was another homicide prosecutor, Billy, who he grew up in Rancho Cordova, and then the sergeant of the homicide team, Jim Barnes. And so we were driving out there, and I just happened to look out and I noticed like all the businesses, all the homes, the apartments, everything had metal bars on both the doors and the windows. I'm like, I've never seen so many metal bars before. And then they commented that it was because of the ear. And I was like, the ear? Who's the ear? And that's when Billy, who grew up in Rancho Cordova, said, the ear. And he almost like whispered it. It's the East Area rapist. He was the boogeyman of my childhood. And so they were talking about how, the rampage of the East Area rapist, who then morphed into the original Night Stalker and the Golden State Killer. And they thought he was dead. And I said, well, if they ever find him, if you guys ever find him, that's the one case I would want to prosecute and have. And then boom, fast forward 6 years later, was when they arrested him. But before they did, there was a whole scene that played out in the office about how I found out about it. And so the way I found out about it was I saw the supervisor of the team and then our number two, the supervisor of the homicide team, and they're whispering to each other in hushed tones. And then they're running around. And there was something going on. And they went into their office, which is right next door to mine, and they closed the door. And I'm in a government building that's been about 50 years old. The wall is real thin. It probably blow on it. It'd probably fall over. So they're whispering. And I just remember I put my ear up against the wall, kind of eavesdrop, like you do as kids. And I remember hearing the word 1 in 16 septillion match to the EAR.
Wow.
Right.
Wow.
And that's a DNA match. And that's in Sacramento, the EAR means one thing and one thing only, the East Area rapist. I nearly fell out of my chair. And that's when I realized they found him.
Yeah, and your office made the press conference on National DNA Day, which is pretty incredible that it could link up like that.
Most definitely. I mean, it's interesting. Sometimes in universe and the stars, they just all lined up together. And that was the day it lined up because it was DNA that solved the case.
Had you ever heard of a case before this that used genetic genealogy to link semen from a scene to a killer?
No, this was the very first case in which forensic evidence from the crime scene was used um, through genetic genealogy to solve a case. And since then, there's been 1,000 cases around the world that have used this technology um, to solve cold cases. Um, are you familiar with sort of how genetic genealogy works?
Yeah, and I thought you explained it really well in the book too. So they extract the DNA sample and then you basically can ping from a public database a family member and then you have this really tenuous job of building this family tree and then getting back to the generation that you believe the match is from and then narrowing it down based on circumstantial evidence to where that person lived, what they looked like based from the victim's accounts. It is really amazing work.
All right, you sound like a lawyer. Uh, you sound like a prosecutor trial lawyer, and that's exactly how it was. But there was a lot of drama behind the scenes, which I covered in the book about how we got that DNA sample. Because what happens is you need really good amount of DNA, where we send it over to a lab to convert it into what we call a SNP profile. That's single nucleotide polymorphism. So that type of profile is used by the genealogy databases, and it measures a million different areas in your chromosome versus a million different areas on somebody else's chromosome. The more places you have in common with somebody, the more closely related. We didn't have any DNA in Sacramento because unfortunately we threw ours away. Contra Costa used it all. Orange County had the DNA, but they wouldn't give it to us. And so we had to go somewhere else to get the DNA. And I talk about that in the book.
Yeah, I wanted to bring that up too because you had discussed how you faced challenges with the Orange County office not handing it over and really assisting you guys when, Detective Paul Holes was like, I think I could figure this out, but I need the sample. Do you find that police departments and other DA's offices are often not working together, or is this just in certain high profile cases where they want to try to figure it out themselves and take credit for it?
What I would tell you is this, a couple of different things. I think that all law enforcement, all DA's offices, we want to solve crime. We want to be able to bring justice to victims. Now, there will be disagreements on the best way to do it. And in the process, there's going to be ego and politics that get involved as well. Um, when we prosecuted the case, I worked with the line deputies at the Orange County DA's office, some of the best DAs that I've ever worked with in my life. Now, at the very top, there's a lot of politics involved, right? And so they wouldn't give us the DNA. They wouldn't give Paul Hose the DNA from their case, and there was plenty of DNA. Part of it, I think, is, you know, part of this thing where they wanted to solve it. They thought their ideas were the best way to do it. They didn't want to hand it over. Um, and so we had to go to Ventura, DA's office to get their DNA and get their agreement, because in the murder of Lyman and Charlene Smith, the coroner in that case in Ventura, Dr. Speth, he had a unique and peculiar practice, which was he always collected two different rape kits from the victims. Most coroners and pathologists collect only one, but he did two. And he was brilliant in his foresight, because what happens is when you collect one sample, that sample goes to the crime lab. The crime lab will retest items after items after items. And so because of that, they're gone, and they're stored in different areas. So the coroner's office took a second sample and kept it pristine in their freezer for 40 plus years. And a detective on another case happened to be searching around at the coroner's uh, office, and lo and behold, found that second rape kit from Charlene Smith. And that's what helped break the case open.
That's amazing. Mom, did you see that at your time at the medical examiner's office? Were they keeping samples like that for decades?
No, and I think that the vision of that guy is remarkable, that he thought ahead like that, and it makes total sense. I mean, working in this field, things get lost. I mean, it's just so important that you can't ever recollect it. So you have to have it, and it's really awesome to hear that that guy, even before he really knew if anything could be done with it, was thinking about that.
Spoken like a true medical examiner there. I mean, Dr. Speth was ahead of his time.
Do you think during the 70s and the early 80s when this was all going down too that GSK could have possibly been caught if the police departments, and you said in the book he committed crimes over 11 different jurisdictions, so is it possible they might have caught him quicker if police departments were more willing to communicate with each other at that time?
I think we would have had a better chance to catch him. Back then, law enforcement, they were siloed, in different departments. Northern California wasn't sharing information with Southern California. Southern California wasn't sharing information with other Southern California jurisdictions. Now everything's online. Now everything is connected together. Um, I don't think that he could have committed the crimes to the degree that he committed and the scope in this day and age without getting caught. We have forensic evidence. We have cell phone evidence. I mean, everybody has a ring camera. Everybody has a surveillance camera. We have license plate readers. So I think it's very difficult in this age to have to commit the scope of the crimes that he did back then. And I think that did contribute to the fact that he wasn't caught for so long. And the other thing was, let's not forget, he was a police officer. He was a police officer who knew the techniques and the investigative protocols of law enforcement. I talked about in the book, the very first series was the Visalia ransacker, where the ransacker was committing 120 burglaries in a 3-mile square radius in Visalia in the central part of California, breaking into homes, sometimes as much as 4, 5, 6 times a night. And it turned out that Joseph D'Angelo, the Golden State Killer, the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, was also the Visalia ransacker, but he was a police officer in a nearby town. He helped out on the task force to find the ransacker, and he was in fact the ransacker.
It is so bizarre. Remember when we covered Jeffrey Dahmer that he had gone to the memorial for some of his victims? It is very bizarre that they like to watch their work with seeing these people being in distress, but knowing you're the person committing them.
I was thinking with Brian Koberger too, for example, like he was in school to be a criminal justice major. It's almost you have to wonder if these people are purposely trying to get into these professions so they could try to get away with crimes.
I think that's a great point. I think there's an element of that where they want to learn the techniques and be able to utilize those techniques to commit their crimes and to evade capture. I mean, when you're looking at um, the even the TV show, what was that, Dexter, right? And other
Yeah.
different type of shows like that. Um, and I think it gave him an advantage. It gave D'Angelo an advantage to escape capture and to commit his crimes. It gave him access to a database. But I think the other thing is when you get into the psychology of somebody like Joseph D'Angelo, right? He felt as if he was above the law and beyond the law, that the law didn't apply to him. And when he became a police officer, it was an extension in his mind. I enforce the law, but the law doesn't apply to me. And it's that for him in particular, it wasn't to serve the community, it was to serve his sick depravity.
It is interesting that he had no foresight about leaving his semen at the scene because obviously that ended up catching him so many years later, but there was just so many circumstantial pieces of evidence that were so disturbing. Like you had discussed in your book that he had left Dr. Pepper at many of the scenes, and then when he was arrested, you found all this Dr. Pepper in his home. And I remember Paul Holes had discussed that he had covered the TVs up with towels and how eerie it was when they went in the home and saw towels covering his devices too. And just little things like that that are so niche that could not possibly be connected to another person.
And I think with the towel, so in several of the sexual assault, he turned on the TV or he turned on the lamp and he put a towel to create this warm glow as he committed his crimes. And Paul is right. When we did the search warrant to get into his house, he put a towel over his monitor, his his computer monitor. But the other thing that people don't know or realize is when he was in his jail cell, he would cover the fluorescent light with a towel to create that glow. So it was almost as if he was reliving his crimes. It was almost as if he was continuing to do it. And when you talk about the PTK killer, right? Um, he said that while there was a certain point where he did stop committing his crimes because he physically couldn't do it anymore, he was still replaying and committing crimes in his head. He was looking at a victim and thinking, how am I going to kidnap her? How am I going to torture her? How am I going to kill her? He was still replaying and thinking about in his mind of committing the crime. In the same way, Joseph D'Angelo, at the age of 73, was in his jail cell. And I have it on video where he was looking out his cell and there was a young blonde female that was working the pod area, delivering food to the different inmates. And he's looking at her and you can tell that he was masturbating to her. So even at the age of 73, the sexual depravity had not yet left him.
That's interesting. So I want to shift some more to the pathology component of this. So a lot of the victims had described that he had an unusually small penis, and then after his arrest, you guys took photos of that. Did you kind of just have that feeling like this is definitely the guy after seeing something like that?
Definitely. So the interesting thing is, in the Orange County crimes, in the Ventura crime, in 3 of the Contra Costa, and 1 of the Santa Barbara, we had DNA evidence connecting him. But in none of the Sacramento, in many of the other crimes in Northern California, and in the murder of Deborah Manning, and in Santa Barbara, um, there was no DNA evidence in that case. Dr. Offerman and Dr. Manning, there was no DNA. So we had to prove those cases by modus operandi. And since many of the victims in Northern California described his penis as being abnormally small, we wanted to verify that piece of evidence to 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 establish that circumstantial evidence. And it was, in fact, extremely. It was a micro penis, as some people have described it. And so when you're talking about the pathology of it, he witnessed his own sister, who was 8 years old, and he was a few years older, being raped on a military base when he was a young boy. And he was tied up, and he felt very helpless from that. He was beaten by his parents. Um, and so when you look at the pathology of it, he felt very powerless, both physically, mentally, and emotionally in his own life. And so he needed to regain some of that control. Now, it doesn't justify it in any way whatsoever, but we try to understand the monster behind the mask and the pathology of it. And so he was a hunter of people instead of animals. And when he was in people's homes, he wanted to play God over them. He draped towels over them, stacked perfume bottles on them. He threatened them. He sexually assaulted them. He ate their food. He drank their beer. He played God over their lives. And it gave him back that sense of control that he probably didn't feel in any aspect of his life. And that's how the monster was created.
The micropenis is very interesting to me because although it can just occur and they don't really know why, a lot of times it's often associated with an underlying genetic disorder or a hormonal disorder, particularly a lack of testosterone in infancy, which they would usually treat with to try to make it grow a little bit larger and it's better treated as a child. And I'm not sure if that's anything that they would have done when he was a younger person, but it's just interesting that that may play a role in it as well, as far as hormone levels of him growing up and different things like that.
When I look at that, we had to recreate his life. From the moment we found him, I recreated every step of his life, from when he was born in Bath, New York, all the way to when he was arrested and even afterwards. And the way I look at it, we sought the death penalty at one point in the case. It's always interesting to understand what created a monster, but at the end of the day, I still have a monster sitting in front of me. And I needed to hold him accountable for what he did, because many people have been victims and have felt trauma in their lives, and yet they don't turn into the monster that he became and inflicted trauma upon other people. But, the stuff you mentioned is really interesting there.
I did think after reading that part of the book about his childhood and what he had witnessed with his sister that it kind of, it added up to what was going on because I've been covering this case or reading about this case since you guys arrested him in 2018. And his MO was so specific, putting plates on people's backs so they couldn't move, covering up the televisions, going through their homes and eating their food, calling them, harassing them after. It's just very specific. And I feel like with all the cases we cover, I haven't heard anything so meticulous and well thought out. And after hearing that, I'm like, okay, this kind of really is adding up to why he's doing this ritual because he's in a way recreating the scene he witnessed, but like you're saying, trying to take control of it this time, but in the worst possible way.
Absolutely. And that's really interesting perspective that you just laid out there. Um, so you watch this or follow this from the beginning. Were you familiar with it before we caught him? With Michelle McNamara's book.
I really wasn't. So when first started, when after he was arrested, I saw that a case was solved with genetic genealogy. I've always been very fascinated with DNA. And then I started reading about it and it just completely blew my mind to become one of my favorite cases ever.
So I have to ask you guys a question. In terms of reading the book, and so there were things that were in the media, things that were covered before. Michelle McNamara obviously wrote her book. Paul Holes wrote his book about the investigation, but my book covered the investigation, the capture, and the prosecution of it. Was there something in my book that kind of caught your attention, that kind of just fascinated you that perhaps you didn't know before, just out of, for my own curiosity?
Oh, definitely. When it came down to his whole background, I feel like I didn't know anything about how he grew up. All I knew was he had a military background and he was a police officer. He was divorced and well, not officially divorced, separated, but had daughters. So that's kind of all I knew about his background. So I feel like the way you laid it out and then when you detailed what happened with the sister, a lot of things started adding back up to me. Also that you guys had searched the house looking for the trinkets. I had no idea that happened. And you gave such a great perspective from the victims that I feel is so rare in true crime books.
Yeah, that was my favorite part of it too, because last week we actually were looking at, because it was Halloween, and we were looking at the movie Scream, and we
Hmm.
were saying that it was inspired by the Gainesville Ripper. And we had a lot of questions after writing that movie was released only 6 years after the murder. And then you find out that Brian Koberger may have been inspired by the Gainesville Ripper and stuff. And sometimes there's so much of a focus on the actual murders that you're wondering if it is inspiring other people instead of thinking about how these victims' families feel with a movie coming out about the deaths of their loved ones, sensationalized only 6 years after they were murdered.
I think what you both said was extremely eloquent and relevant. One of my inspiration for writing the book, and I wrote it 5 years after the case ended, was really to give a voice to victims. You know, uh, when I was first assigned the case, the first thing I did was I went on Amazon and bought Michelle McNamara's book because I
Mhm.
just wanted a whole kind of view of the case. And when I read it, I couldn't sleep. And Michelle wrote her book, and then she passed away before we found him. So she was, focused on him and focused on the crime and trying to find him. And then Paul wrote his book in terms of how came up with an idea, technology, forensic technology to solve the case. And I view my book as the third in the trilogy, right? The end that covers everything. But I really wanted to give voice to and honor the generations of law enforcement that never gave up their search for him. But in addition, I wanted to make sure that the victims that their voice came through, that I show how they turned pain into power, and they really drove what happened on the end of the at the end of the case, and that stuff frankly, was never really talked about publicly. And so I wanted to make sure I did that to honor them. And a part of my proceeds from the book, it goes to honor, a nonprofit, Phyllis's Garden, that was started by several of the survivors.
No, that's absolutely incredible. And I thought, the detailing of the crimes itself and how it affected each victim individually, and then you having to deal with them decades later and having to tell them, we caught this guy. We're potentially seeking the death penalty. Never mind, there's a plea deal. Nobody really talks about how emotional that could be over the years. And some of these people weren't even able to see justice. This happened 40 years ago. Some people passed away. So to see you guys handle this case with such care and be able to let them go up there, do their victim impact statements, and share their stories in such a tasteful way was really great as a reader.
Thank you. That means a lot to me.
The victim impact statements, I know that you said that some of them had a huge impact on you. Can you describe some of that for us?
Yes. And I'll talk about um, the two of them in particular. The first was Phyllis. So Phyllis is the first sexual assault victim in Sacramento. And I remember the first time I met Phyllis. She it was my first time in court. And there is this lady that comes up to me, and she's in her early 60s, late 50s. It looks like it, gray hair. She's got these thick, round Coke bottle glasses. And she comes up and she reaches her hand down. She shakes my hand and she says, "Hi, my name is Phyllis. I'm victim number one." And we sat down and we talked, and other victims came up. "Hi, I'm Chris. I'm victim number 10, right?" But I sat down and I talked with Phyllis, and I was kind of just going over what was happening in the case. But it was surreal for me because I had read Phyllis's police report. Read her victim impact her victim statement to law enforcement. I'd seen the pictures, and I had this image of Phyllis, and now I am 40 something years later, and it was as if I was reaching across time and space, right? The sweetest person in the world. And every time I come to court, Phyllis was sitting right there. But near the end of the case, Phyllis told me that she was diagnosed with cancer and she couldn't make it to court. And so she couldn't make it to the date where he accepted guilt. And so when we did the allocution and went to the facts of Phyllis's case, she wasn't there, but all the other victims stood up for her. Fast forward 2 months later, we're going through the impact statement, and I'm looking forward to seeing Phyllis and hearing her and just you know coming over and sitting with her. And she was going to come to read her impact statement, but she was just so tired. She was just so tired and worn out from the chemo and everything else, and she couldn't make it. And her sister came and read the impact statement about how it affected her, how she couldn't sleep alone anymore, how she had to set up an alarm system and locks all around her house, and her husband couldn't leave town for very long. She became a prisoner in her own home. And what does that do to you over the years? How does that eat away at you, right? And then I remember a couple of days later when D'Angelo was going to get his sentence, and I look across the makeshift courtroom and I see Phyllis sitting there. And she had this mask on. We're in the middle of COVID. She had this twinkle in her eye. And for the first time in 40 years, she was able to obtain a measure of justice. 3 months later, Phyllis passed away from cancer. And so it meant the world to me that we were able to get her that justice that day in court, because if we kept moving forward, she would have never seen that moment because she passed away. And that's something that will stay with me forever. Um, the other person that really affected me in terms of their impact statement was Jane Carson. Jane wrote her own book, Frozen in Fear. She became a colonel in the military. She was a nurse. He assaulted her, with her son, her infant, her toddler son nearby. And Jane at the impact statement, she brought Bonnie, and Bonnie was D'Angelo's ex-fiancée. And it was a very dramatic moment in the courtroom. And Jane went, "And here's Bonnie," you know, and she did it to try to get a reaction from D'Angelo. And I'm sitting no more than 6 feet away from D'Angelo. He's got a mask on. He's sitting there looking straight ahead. But when Bonnie's name was mentioned, I could tell that his breathing stopped for a moment. You could see him gulp, and it became a rapid breathing. So it had an effect, which is exactly what Jane wanted. And Jane is such you know, a really powerful, advocate for victims. And, I really, always think highly of Jane. I talk to her about once a year. She was recently out doing true crime stuff at Comic Con or Crime Con. And so she goes every year, and we were talking about connecting as well.
That's amazing. That kind of reminds me of the Koberger victim impact statement, because when the Gonsalves family went up and started attacking his character, that's when you could really see him getting mad. He doesn't care that people are upset. He cares about people going after him.
Yes.
Yeah, and we were sitting there watching it live, and then the first couple ones, I mean, like, I understand that victims want to cry and they want to say, "Oh, my life has been affected," but I just don't think that these people care. And I was saying to Maria, if that was me, I would be studying that guy to see how I could get under his skin.
Exactly.
And it sounds like that's what happened in your case. And it happened with the Brian Koberger case when the one victim's sister went up and was just digging into him, and you could see him physically sitting there and being uncomfortable. And that, I guess, that gives the victim's family some kind of satisfaction that you could still bother a person that's that sick.
Yep. They got to him. And that's what Jane was doing. I mean, Jane's just a source of power. And I can see that, that's exactly what you do. That's what I would do. And Koberger, I mean, the sister, I mean, that's great because you want to get to them. You want to make them feel something, make them squirm, right?
Oh, totally. And it was so badass that you made him wear that clear mask Because he was essentially behind a mask his whole life, he needs to now own up to what he did. Doesn't matter that he's an old man trying to fake being this feeble old man when you guys know that's not the deal.
Well, I'm glad you enjoyed that part. That has never been made public. So, when he committed his crimes, he wore a mask. And as we were getting ready for the case to come to a conclusion, and we were in court, it's in the middle of COVID, right? What do we wear in public, right? A mask. But I didn't want him hide behind the mask, so I had to go through a lot of machinations and stuff, in court with the judge to make sure that he wore a clear face shield. He couldn't hide behind it. So if you go and you look at that first court appearance, that's exactly what he has. And so it's interesting, putting the pieces. If you read the book and then you go back and watch some of the videos, it'll give you insight on the stuff that was behind the scenes that people don't really know about.
Oh, definitely. So, before this case, had you ever had to work a case before with so many other DA offices? Because I can't imagine that was awesome for you guys to have to deal with.
It's very rare. So typically in my office, you try the case by yourself. You got nobody else with you other in that courtroom. There could be 2, 3 defense attorneys, so alone I walk in that courtroom alone. I sit there and alone, I try to, slay the monster before us. In rare situation, we will assign 2 prosecutors to it. And it's very rare that you have this many prosecutors. I mean, he committed his crimes in 11 different counties, and there were 6 participating counties, and nearly every one of those counties had somebody assigned to it. So, attorneys, we're A-type personalities. We're aggressive by nature. We're drivers. So you had to figure out how to deal with it. Now, among the line deputies, so the way we work is, you have your elected DA, you have your executives, you have your supervisors, you have your line deputies. The line deputies are the ones that are in the trenches, on the front lines. And that's what I was, for most of that case. I'm not anymore, obviously, but at that time I was. And we got along great among the line deputies. I mean, because we were all moving in one direction. Some of us would work on a mental defense. Some of us would work, on the DNA stuff. Other ones of us would, work in different areas of it and strategize and do some research motion. And so, um, it was a collaborative experience from the line deputy. Above that, it was a bit more challenging, as I talked about in the book.
Yeah, that's interesting. And you had one of our previous guests, Matt Murphy, on your team as well.
Yes. So yeah. So Matt came on your show. What was Matt talking about, by the way?
Matt came on when his book came out last year, and he talked about, all the cases he had worked on. We got really into Rodney Alcala, the dating game killer, and he's been an awesome resource. We met him at CrimeCon the last 2 years, and he's a great guy.
Yeah. Murph is a good dude. I mean, I joked around with him when he was on the case. He was only on there for a short period of time before he left the office, but you know, Murph, he goes surfing, he out there, in his wetsuit out there. And he was a great prosecutor. I mean, a good, legit trial lawyer. He knows his stuff, and it was good to have him on the case for the short time that we did. Enjoyed working with him. And so he's a good guy and well versed in the criminal justice area.
What first got you interested in this field?
You know, so in the book, and it's interesting how I set it up. So, have you guys watched the movie The Titanic?
Yeah, of course.
So the Titanic, right? And the way I set up the book, and I'm explain why. Um, the Titanic has the A, the B, and the C story. Right? So the A story is the search for the Hope Diamond. The B story is the love story between Kate and Leo. And the C story is the sinking of the Titanic, right? And so in the book, I set up the A story as the investigation, capture, and prosecution of GSK. The B story is my story, and the C story is the story of the victims and the survivors. Um, in terms of my story, and I covered in the book as the B story, I was born in Vietnam. My family left when we faced a dictatorship in Vietnam, and South Saigon, South Vietnam fell. So we left and escaped on a fishing boat, ran out of gas, food, and water. We were just drifting on the ocean near death until we were rescued. I spent 6 months in a refugee camp in Malaysia. When I came to this country, I couldn't understand a single word of English. I joke around that I learned how to speak English by watching Bugs Bunny cartoons. 20 years later, graduated from law school. And when I when I graduated from law school, I wanted to give back to this country, gave my family everything we could have ever imagined. And so I became a public servant, and there's no greater public servant in my mind than a prosecutor who stands up for victims and fights for victims. In Vietnam, there was no system of justice. There was no prosecutor, no jury, no defense attorney. There was just, you know, uh, a dictator who made decisions about people's lives. And so I became a prosecutor to really give back to this country. And so in that process, I wanted to be a voice for victims. Who is the voice for the child that was molested? Who stands up for the undocumented mother that was beaten by her boyfriend and is afraid to call the police? Who stands there for the mother who lost a child in a drive-by shooting, by a gang member? It's the prosecutor. And so to me, that was just a way of giving back to this country. And once I got into it, I loved it. I love the notion of service.
Do you ever get I mean, I guess you hear the most horrible stories of how people treat each other. Is it anything that you ever take home with you and affect your life outside of work?
I wrote about it in the book, about the sin eaters, right? In England, they had these people that were sin eaters that they would pay and bring to funerals that they eat a piece of bread. And it was not to absolve the individual of their sins, but to take away some of that darkness so that the person can then move on to the afterlife. And I think first responders, whether you're a firefighter, a police, a prosecutor, a medical examiner, we see people at their worst, right? When somebody comes and sees me or comes into my world, it's either because they are a victim of a crime with the very fabric of their lives ripped apart, or they're a defendant who's looking at life in prison. Same thing with a medical examiner. You're seeing people at the worst moment, their death, the aftermath, and all the victim's family. And it's hard not to take that in. It's hard not to be hardened by it. I remember, when I was prosecuting sex crimes, in particular child molestation crimes, I would, look at grandfather playing with his grandkids in the park, and I'd be thinking, is that guy a molester, right?
Mhm.
Um, my daughters, when they were growing up, they never had a sleepover, never. You
Yeah.
know, it's just that part of me, right? Nothing good happens after midnight, and so we had a curfew, and so it does affect you. It jades you. I mean, I'm sure in your line, I mean, did it do that to you, for example?
Oh yeah, I you pick certain things and ignore other things. Just for some reason I'm very terrified of my kids getting I mean, they're getting older now, but getting hit by a car when they were younger just cuz they just dart into the street, things like that. I would never let my husband ever go on a motorcycle. It's my
Yes.
only rule in my marriage.
Even though he's a fireman and goes in
Well,
burning buildings every day.
that's exactly why though, because I say, okay, you could potentially die at work every day. You're not dying on your days off.
Exactly.
But
My
do you do
motorcycle.
anything else like that in your life besides not letting your kids have sleepovers?
Yeah, so my son, he's a teenager, he's in high school. So I told him you would never ride a motorcycle in your life. And I told my girls you would never ride a motorcycle, be on a motorcycle, but I told the same well, because I've seen the images, I've seen the pictures. Um, my kids I have two that are in college, and one that's in high school, but you know, I track them. I track where they go, and nothing good ever happens after midnight. But there's only so much I can do on it because we see the worst of people. So it does, And I have a difficult time sleeping. I don't sleep very much. When you're absorbing all this in, it's not like a light switch that you can just turn on and off. It stays on all the time. Um, And it's been years since, the Golden State Killers, the GSK was the last case that I personally handled. If I'm gonna handle the last case, that's gonna be the last case. But, the cases, they still haunt you. There are things that will trigger you. But that's, we took in a lot of darkness and sins.
Well, I think on that note, you did such a good job speaking from the victim's perspective and giving that insight into how it affected their lives, what was going on, how his crimes affected the whole community.
So that's why, I would love for people to buy the book. Like I said, part of the proceeds go to the victims, but it really gives them a voice and it changes the perspective, I think, of the true crime genre. I mean, I know that you guys probably read a lot of true crime books and I hope that it lived up to some of the expectation. Um, I do sort of, when I talk to people about the book who've read the book, one of the challenges I had was kind of jumping back and forth between time. And I was just curious, were you able to kind of follow the time jumps and the juxtaposition and all of that and the different storylines?
Oh, definitely. I actually liked that format a lot because I feel like you were describing the crime and then what was happening in modern day with those specific set of circumstances. And I found that easier to follow than in some books where they lay out everything that happened 40 years ago and then everything that happened today. So I really liked that different way of writing. I thought it was really good to follow the case that way, especially if people don't know about it. I think it's very easy to follow what was going on because this case is very involved and there are a lot of details and it's easy to get confused.
Yeah, and especially for people like us, we I mean, I went to school for pathology, Maria went to art school. We have no idea what happens in the legal world and we always have questions and just all of this terminology that we read in articles all the time, we don't really understand what it means and how they get to those conclusions. So it was really helpful for that stuff too.
Yeah, I
That's
appreciated you too, just saying like I had to go back to textbooks from that time and see what the laws were at that time because as a regular person, I don't understand. I wish I could be a lawyer, but I always joke that I cry when I get emotional and nobody wants a lawyer that's crying. So
you know
I
what?
look,
That can be powerful in and of itself, who you are and where your emotion. It was I'd never written a book. This is my first book. And honestly, I never thought that was, as a kid learning English, being in ESL, English as a second language for 6 years, I never thought I'd be a lawyer, much less write a book. And so the process of writing it was interesting. I wrote the book in 7 months, essentially. Um, and I sat down, I wrote a very detailed outline. It was 30 pages long. Um, and every morning when I decided, all right, got to get to work, got to write the book, right? Because I had a deadline. Um, I just wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning and write for 2 hours, um, and and just write a section, send it to my editor in New York, who'd review it, fix the grammar, fix the structure, suggestions, send it back to me, and then I just add on to it and send it back. But you know, and I had to, do research and go back and look at some stuff, look at my notes, kind of jog my memory, different things. But it was a really interesting process writing the book. And one of the things I try to really do is simplify some of the legal terms so that people who are non-lawyers could understand it, give a little bit of knowledge, but not too much, make it interesting, without getting lost in the weeds.
amazing.
Well, you're a really awesome writer, and I think that you should not stop with this book. And I think that I know the title for your next book, which
Whereas
is
that
Nothing Good Happens After Midnight. Perfect.
I love that. I love that. Well, I hope that because you guys go to Crime Con every year. Is that fair to
Yeah.
say?
Yeah.
Well, so are you? And I have to admit, I have not been to Crime Con. I almost went this year, but I had a scheduling conflict. Do you have a podcast row that you're at during Crime Con?
The last 2 years we've had a live show and then my mom does a solo lecture, so we haven't had a booth, but we might in the future.
Right. Well, this coming year is going to be in Vegas, and my intention is to go. I would love to meet you both in person to do a little, whatever show or anything that we could do, live from Vegas. We'll call it live from Vegas knows death.
Yeah,
Nothing
that would
good.
be so cool. I'd love that.
No, absolutely amazing. Thank you, Tin, so much for coming on our show. The People versus the Golden State Killer is coming out next Tuesday, November 11th. Please pre order the book. That is huge for sales. I can't recommend this book enough, guys.
Good luck with everything.
Thank,
Seriously, it's awesome.
awesome. Thank you so much. Love being on your show.
Thank you for listening to Mother Knows Death. As a reminder, my training is as a pathologist assistant. I have a master's level education and specialize in anatomy and pathology education. I am not a doctor and I have not diagnosed or treated anyone, dead or alive, without the assistance of a licensed medical doctor. This show, my website, and social media accounts are designed to educate and inform people based on my experience working in pathology so they can make healthier decisions regarding their life and well-being. Always remember that science is changing every day, and the opinions expressed in this episode are based on my knowledge of those subjects at the time of publication. If you are having a medical problem, have a medical question, or are having a medical emergency, please contact your physician or visit an urgent care center, emergency room, or hospital. Please rate, review, and subscribe to Mother Knows Death on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere you get podcasts. Thanks.